Hey everyone, welcome back to Sip and Talk.
We've been sorting through some really fascinating questions you've sent us.
Yeah, lots of thoughtful ones.
All center on how countries navigate these, well, complex global topics. You've asked about identifying the real aggressor in conflicts, the true purpose behind nations building up massive military forces.
Right, and how governments try to justify their actions on the world stage. Things that aren't always straightforward.
Exactly. These questions get right to the heart of international relations today. They aren't just about troop movements. They're really tangled up with narrative, international law, the whole information landscape.
Mm-hmm. And it's incredibly easy to get caught up in the claims and counterclaims, without really understanding the underlying dynamics.
And that's precisely what we want to tackle in this deep dive. Our mission is to take the information we've gathered based on your questions and really unpack these specific issues.
Help you understand some of the facts, the patterns at play.
And crucially, how different countries frame their own actions, and maybe even more importantly, how they frame the actions of others.
So today we're going to dive into those accusations of terrorism in the Russia-Ukraine conflict.
Then we'll explore the complex purpose of military power, using the situation around China, Taiwan, and the U.S. as a sort of case study.
And finally, we'll pull back the curtain on a common tactic used by countries maybe looking to justify aggressive actions. This claim that they were somehow provoked.
Okay, sounds like a plan. Let's jump right in with that first topic then. The terrorism label. Russia has repeatedly accused Ukraine of carrying out terrorist attacks.
We've all heard that.
They point to things like drone and missile strikes happening inside Russia, specifically mentioning targets like the Crimea Bridge, various Russian military bases.
And it's important to pause there. Think about why that word terrorism is so potent and why it gets thrown around so much.
Yeah.
In international relations, calling someone a terrorist or accusing a state of supporting terrorism, it's a highly charged political act. It's often less about a strict legal definition and more about delegitimizing your opponent, framing them as outside the norms of warfare, trying to sway international opinion, domestic opinion too. It's a powerful tool in the information war.
Right. So let's just clarify. What does terrorism typically mean, like in a common understanding, or even when people try to define it internationally? What are the key characteristics?
Generally, the core idea involves violence or threats of violence aimed primarily at civilians or non-combatants.
Civilians, okay.
And the specific goal is often to create widespread fear, panic, social disruption, to terrorize the population, not just defeat a military force.
Got it.
And while historically maybe it was linked more to non-state groups, state actors can absolutely use methods that fit these characteristics.
Okay. Targeting civilians, creating panic, not typical military-on-military action. So how do Ukraine's actions, the ones Russia calls terrorism, how do they actually stack up against that description based on the information we have?
Well, Ukraine's consistent argument, based on what we've seen reported, is that their targets are military objectives.
Okay.
Or facilities with significant dual military-civilian use that directly support the invasion. Think supply lines, fuel depots, military bases, radar installations. Things like that.
And they stress that they're acting in self-defense, right?
Absolutely. That's fundamental to their whole position, legally and politically. Under international law, like Article 51 of the UN Charter, a state that's invaded has the right to self-defense.
Which includes striking back.
Which includes taking military action against the aggressor's military capability.
Yes. And Ukraine claims these strikes inside Russia are precise, that they're aimed at military stuff, trying not to hit civilians.
Yes, that's their stated policy. We saw examples cited, like that drone attack on June 1st, 2025. Reports indicated it targeted military air bases, strategic bombers.
Right.
And importantly, the reports mentioned no civilian casualties from that specific incident.
Okay.
Another example was the June 3rd, 2025 attack on the Crimea Bridge. Ukrainian sources reportedly claimed responsibility, said they used underwater explosives.
And their reasoning.
They explicitly emphasized the target was the bridge's military supply capability. They said no civilians were harmed. They framed it as hitting a critical military logistical link for the invasion force.
So if you take Ukraine's description, military targets, self-defense, avoiding civilians, it sounds more like conventional military strikes in a conflict, not really terrorism as usually defined.
That's the key distinction they and many international observers draw. Military action against military targets, especially in a war of self-defense, is fundamentally different from deliberately targeting civilians to spread terror.
But Russia still calls it terrorism. So what's their justification? Why use that specific label?
Well, Russia focuses on the fact that the attacks cross the border. They also claim civilian facilities sometimes get hit. Though, as the information suggests, that might be incidental damage from hitting military-linked targets, or maybe something Russia emphasizes for narrative purposes.
Okay.
They also point to hitting things like parts of the Moscow business district as targeting symbolic areas to instill fear. They argue these aren't purely military and are designed for psychological impact.
I see.
And they also mention these actions happen without a formal declaration of war, which honestly is kind of a moot point in modern conflicts, but they use it in their narrative. Putin himself called the 2022 Crimea bridge explosion a terrorist act almost immediately.
So Russia's using the terrorist label to try and paint Ukraine's defensive actions as, what, illegal? Morally wrong? Casting Ukraine as the aggressor?
Precisely. It's about twisting the narrative, portraying themselves, the invading force, as somehow the victim of these illegitimate attacks.
Okay, right. That's Russia's claim about Ukraine. But let's flip the script for a second. Based on the information we looked at, what about Russia's own actions? Do their methods maybe align more closely with those characteristics of terrorism?
This is where the information presents a really stark contrast. If you look at the conduct of Russia's war, many of their actions seem to fit definitions associated with state terrorism much more closely than Ukraine's targeted strikes.
Like what? Give us some examples.
The systematic, often indiscriminate bombing and shelling of Ukrainian cities.
Right.
We're not just talking about hitting a military base nearby. We're talking direct strikes on residential buildings, hospitals, schools, shopping malls, civilian infrastructure.
The Mariupol theater comes to mind.
Exactly. The theater in Mariupol where children was written clearly outside in huge letters. It was bombed anyway, killing hundreds sheltering inside. That wasn't a military target. It was a civilian refuge. Plain and simple.
And the attacks on essential services, energy infrastructure.
Absolutely. That sustained campaign, especially over the winter, to destroy Ukraine's energy grid, their heating infrastructure. The stated goal from some Russian figures was pretty explicit. Make life unbearable for Ukrainian civilians. Freeze them into submission. Break their will by denying basic services. That's a direct attack on civilians aimed at causing suffering and panic. It aligns very closely with terrorism characteristics.
And the types of weapons being used?
The reported use of weapons like cluster munitions, white phosphorus in populated urban areas, these weapons are inherently indiscriminate.
They spread out.
They spread their effects wide, making it almost impossible to avoid civilian casualties in residential zones. Using them like that is often seen as a deliberate tactic to terrorize.
And beyond the bombing, other actions targeting civilians.
Yeah, the forced displacement and kidnapping of Ukrainian civilians, especially children taken from occupied territories relocated to Russia.
That's horrifying.
International bodies call it a war crime, but it also functions as a tactic of terror, tearing families apart, erasing identity, controlling people through fear. It's state-level action causing immense psychological trauma.
So when you compare these things, systematic targeting of civilians, trying to cause panic, using indiscriminate weapons in cities, kidnapping kids, and you put that next to the typical characteristics of terrorism.
They seem to align far more closely than Ukraine's actions, which are consistently framed as targeted military strikes in self-defense.
Right.
Russia's methods, based on the evidence presented, look designed to terrorize the civilian population as a tool of war.
So the conclusion here, based on the information, seems pretty unavoidable. Russia uses the terrorist label against Ukraine mostly as a political weapon, a propaganda move.
Right.
But if you look at the actual conduct of the war, Russia's own actions seem to fit the description of terrorism far better.
It really highlights how loaded that term is and how it can be, weaponized in these situations, often completely opposite to the reality on the ground.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit then. If framing and narrative are so crucial, let's think about military power itself. Why do countries build up these huge armies, advanced weapons, deploy forces all over? Is it always just because they want to start a fight?
Not at all. Actually, in many cases, especially in really tense situations, the main stated purpose of building up military power is the exact opposite.
To prevent a conflict.
Exactly, to prevent it from starting. That's the whole concept of deterrence.
And a really clear example of this dynamic, looking at the information we have, is the situation involving China, Taiwan, and the United States.
Absolutely. It's a classic complex case. Let's break down the perspectives there. China's stated goal regarding Taiwan is unification.
Right.
This objective is incredibly important for the Chinese Communist Party's legitimacy. It's framed as a core national interest, non-negotiable almost.
And while they say they prefer non-military means?
Yes, they use what some call cognitive warfare. Economic pressure, cyber attacks, regular military posturing, flying planes near Taiwan, sailing ships around. But military force is explicitly kept on the table.
As a last resort.
As a last resort, yeah.
Yeah.
Especially if peaceful unification looks impossible, or maybe if there are domestic problems and an external conflict could be a distraction or rally support.
Okay. And the United States in this, what's their primary objective?
Their stated main goal is maintaining peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific, and the core strategy for that is deterrence.
Stopping China from using force.
Creating conditions that discourage China from using military force against Taiwan in the first place. It's about preventing the war, not necessarily planning to fight and win one if it starts, although having that capability is key for the deterrence to be believable.
So what are the U.S. strategies for this deterrence? How do they try to achieve it?
Well, it's evolved. Historically, the U.S. used what was called strategic ambiguity.
Right. Being vague about intervening.
Exactly. Intentionally not saying definitely if they would intervene militarily if China attacked. The idea was to keep both Beijing and Taipei guessing, deter China, but also maybe deter Taiwan from declaring independence unilaterally and sparking a crisis.
And now, has that shifted?
The emphasis seems to have shifted more towards what's called dynamic deterrence or integrated deterrence. This involves a more visible strengthening of the U.S. military presence in the Indo-Pacific.
How so?
It relies heavily on deepening military cooperation with key allies. Japan, Australia, the Philippines. Think joint exercises, shared intelligence, coordinated strategies. The U.S. also conducts regular naval transits through the Taiwan Strait, framing it as demonstrating commitment to freedom of navigation.
And they're helping Taiwan defend itself, too.
Crucially, yes. Under the Taiwan Relations Act, the U.S. provides Taiwan with defensive weapons and services. And the focus is increasingly on helping Taiwan build up asymmetric warfare capabilities.
Asymmetric. What does that mean here?
It means capabilities that are highly effective, but maybe lower cost, designed to counter a much larger conventional force, like swarms of drones, anti-ship missiles, mobile coastal defenses, sea mines, cyber tools.
And making an invasion really hard and costly.
Exactly. Making it incredibly difficult and expensive for China, regardless of China's bigger numbers in ships or planes.
So what's Taiwan's own goal and strategy in all this?
Taiwan's goal is pretty straightforward. Defend their island, their democracy, their people. Their strategy is to build a defense force that can inflict massive costs on any attacker. And importantly, to survive long enough if an attack happens, to allow for potential international help or reaction to kick in. Buying time.
This brings us to that really interesting core insight from the information here. For all three, China, the U.S., Taiwan, the huge military power they have or are building isn't necessarily seen by them just as a tool to start a war, but rather as a tool to prevent one.
Yes, that's the sort of paradox of deterrence, isn't it? China builds its military not just to be able to invade, but maybe more importantly, to deter the U.S. from stepping in if they do decide to use force, and to coerce Taiwan towards unification without a fight. Their buildup aims for a situation where, if force is used, it's fast, decisive.
Because a long war would be bad for them.
A long war or failure would risk domestic instability, maybe even the regime's survival. So they want deterrence and a quick win option.
And the U.S. deterrent strategy isn't necessarily about guaranteeing they'd win or even that they'd definitely intervene.
Correct. It's more about creating enough uncertainty and risk for China, making Beijing doubt whether an invasion would be quick or successful or worth cost internationally, domestically. That uncertainty itself is seen as a key part of deterrence.
And strengthening allies plays into that.
Absolutely. It's not just about raw military power. It builds a collective security network, complicates China's planning, reinforces regional stability.
And Taiwan's own military efforts are part of this deterrence picture, too.
Definitely. By building up those asymmetric capabilities, Taiwan makes itself, a really tough target. A porcupine, some say. It raises the potential cost of invasion for China, maybe to an unacceptable level. It makes that quick win scenario China might hope for much less likely. And that strengthens deterrence overall.
The information even mentions some newer ideas about deterrence, like using lots of autonomous systems, drones, unmanned ships.
Yeah, leveraging large-scale autonomous systems to counter a potential numerical advantage. It's about showing you have a credible way to make the other side's plan fail or be too costly, even if your forces look different on paper. It's a complex game.
A game of risk assessment, signaling.
Psychological and strategic. The military power is there, but its primary role, in this context, is intended to convince the other side that starting something just isn't worth the price.
So summing up this segment, in really tense spots like the Taiwan Strait, these massive military forces are kind of counterintuitively seen by the countries involved as tools for keeping the peace.
Or at least preventing outright war.
By making the cost and risk of starting a war just too high for anyone, creating a standoff where nobody wants to make the first big aggressive move. It's all about deterring the other side.
The goal is to make the price of aggression prohibitive, ideally ensuring peace through the fear of war itself.
Okay, so if military power is ideally meant to prevent war through deterrence, what happens when tensions stay sky high or conflict does break out? How do countries, especially those seen as the aggressors, try to justify what they're doing?
Well, that brings us to another really common strategic communication tactic.
Which is?
The provocation theory.
Provocation theory.
This is a very, very common narrative device you see on the international stage.
Explain the core idea for us.
Essentially, it's where a country that's initiating aggression or maybe escalating a conflict tries to frame its own actions not as its choice, but as a necessary response to something the other side supposedly did, a provocation.
The classic, they started it. Excuse.
Exactly, but on a massive geopolitical scale. And the purpose is, well, it's got several layers. It's designed to shift blame.
Make themselves look like the victim.
Precisely. Portraying themselves as the victim who had no other choice. This helps rally support at home, creates a narrative of righteous self-defense against someone unreasonable. And internationally, it tries to muddy the waters, confuse people, reduce condemnation.
And we see clear examples of this tactic in the information we reviewed.
Absolutely. Look at Russia's rhetoric about Ukraine. Before the full-scale invasion in 2022, they kept claiming Ukraine wanting closer ties with the West, especially NATO, was an unacceptable provocation.
Right, I remember that.
They also framed Ukraine's actions in the Donbass, defending its own territory against Russian-backed forces as provocations against Russian interests or Russian speakers, even though it was sovereign Ukrainian land. And even now, like we discussed, they label Ukraine's counterattacks on Russian military targets as terrorist acts that justify Russia's own ongoing military actions. The invasion itself, in their story, was forced on them by Ukraine's provocations.
And China uses a very similar playbook regarding Taiwan.
Exactly the same logic, it seems. China frames Taiwan's democratic self-governance, just the fact that Taiwan exists as a free society, separate from PRC rule, as a fundamental provocation towards independence.
So just existing democratically is a provocation.
In their narrative, yes. Any interaction Taiwan has with other countries, especially high-level visits like Speaker Pelosi's, or even visits by U.S. ambassadors mentioned in the info, Beijing immediately labels them provocations, violating the One China principle, undermining peace, they say.
Even Taiwan's own defensive military exercises.
Frequently described as provocations. And then China uses these supposed provocations as the reason for their own escalation.
It's like military drills.
Exactly. They'll run huge military drills around Taiwan, fly lots of jets across the Taiwan Strait median line, impose economic pressure, and then claim these are just necessary responses to Taiwanese or U.S. provocations.
It really highlights the pattern here, doesn't it, and the contradiction. Both Russia and China take what look like normal diplomatic interactions or defensive preparations by the other side, or even just internationally recognized rights.
Like self-determination or forming alliances.
And they just unilaterally define those things as provocations.
They draw the line wherever it suits them, and then they accuse the other side of crossing it, which then supposedly justifies their own aggressive moves.
Yeah.
That whole framing, we're the victim, we're just responding, it's crucial for masking the fact that they're the ones initiating the military pressure or the conflict.
And this ties back to that point in the information about why some countries might be wary of China, and China sometimes saying it feels suppressed or contained by the world.
It raises that critical question, doesn't it? Are the reactions China sometimes faces internationally, the ones that might call suppression or provocation, are they maybe actually consequences of China's own behavior?
What kind of behavior?
Well, The information touched on things like China's lack of transparency in certain areas, its increasing restrictions on its own citizens, citing things like strict exit controls, limited passport access compared to, say, Taiwan's citizens who travel freely, and its more assertive, sometimes seen as aggressive, foreign policy.
So maybe the international caution isn't about China just being strong, but about how it uses that strength, how it interacts.
That's the key thing to consider. If a powerful country operates with limited transparency, clamps down on freedoms at home in ways that worry others, and acts coercively abroad, it's probably going to generate some pushback, some caution, some distrust.
Right.
China might interpret that pushback as suppression, but you could argue it's a predictable reaction to its own actions and system, not just some unprovoked hostility from the outside world.
It really shows how this provocation theory is a strategic use of language. It often flips aggressor and victim. To see clearly, you really have to look past the rhetoric and see who's actually taking the concrete military steps, who's escalating things.
Actions really do speak louder than words, especially when the words seem designed to mislead or justify aggression.
Okay, let's try and wrap this up. Let's pull together the main threads from this deep dive. We've seen how labels like terrorism can be weaponized politically.
Often in ways that don't match the actual conduct on the ground, sometimes even fitting the accuser better.
Right, and we've looked at how military buildups, especially intense standoffs like the China-Taiwan-US situation, are often framed by those involved as being for deterrence.
For preventing war by making the cost too high. A sort of paradoxical peace through strength or perhaps fear.
And finally, we unpack the provocation theory. That tactic where escalating powers paint themselves as the injured party, forced to act, blaming the victim by calling normal, defensive, or sovereign actions provocations.
Understanding these patterns, the strategic language, the narratives, how military power is framed and used, it's really critical for navigating today's complex world.
It gives you, the listener, tools to look past the headlines, past the official statements, and to critically evaluate the claims being made.
Encourages you to look for the evidence in actions, not just words.
It's about trying to see the reality underneath all the layers of political spin. So here's a final thought for you to chew on after this deep dive. Given that countries use language and narrative so strategically, and even military power gets framed completely differently depending on who's talking, how can you develop a consistent way to figure out what's really going on?
Yeah, what should you look for?
What specific types of actions, maybe, rather than just words, should you consistently look for across different situations to judge who's genuinely acting defensively versus who might be using claims of provocation or terrorism as a kind of smokescreen for their own aggression?
It's a tough question, but a vital one. It requires careful observation, critical thinking, especially in the world we live in now, saturated with information and disinformation.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive into these global narratives. We hope this has given you some valuable perspectives to consider.
I just want to give another shout out to Micky from Mickytolife. His channel is a treasure trove of inspiration, and he's a huge Sip&Talk fan.
Absolutely. Make sure to check him out and maybe even share your awesome podcast intro with him once you've created it.